The first son. The story of the Murphy family does not begin in the cemetery where 7 identical headstones stand in silent formation, though that's where it ends. No, it begins on a bitter March morning in 1868, when the eldest Murphy son, Patrick, stepped into the Pennsylvania mines and never returned alive. From the outside, his death resembled countless others swallowed by the coal pits of America's industrial age. But there was something too precise, too deliberate about how the explosion claimed him, and only him. Something that made witnesses whisper his name with a trembling reverence, as though speaking it aloud risked summoning the fate that haunted the Murphy line. To the townspeople, Patrick's grave was just another marker in a row of tragedies. But to his mother, Margaret, it was the first toll of a clock she swore she could hear, one that rang only for her sons, counting down to their 21st birthdays. And she was right. Millfield, 1846-2. Decades before Patrick's death, Millfield was not yet the husk of a town it would become, but a booming experiment in corporate power. Rows of identical wooden homes marched up the hillsides like obedient soldiers. The air stank of sulfur and coal dust, a metallic tang that worked its way into clothing and lungs alike. Seamus Murphy arrived with soot already etched into the lines of his face. He was 28, older than most immigrants, his eyes carrying both the sharpness of a bookkeeper and the weariness of a man who had already buried too many dreams back in famine-stricken Ireland. Unlike other refugees, Seamus carried a letter of introduction, a mysterious benefactor's promise of safe passage and employment with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company. To the residents of Millfield, Keystone was not just an employer. It was God, landlord, judge, and executioner. The company owned the houses, the stores, the schools, even the cemetery where workers would one day be laid to rest beneath stone paid for in company scrip. It was in this suffocating world that Seamus met Margaret O'Connell. She was dark-haired, storm-eyed, educated enough to see the cracks in Millfield's shiny promises. They married in the fall of that year, a wedding celebrated with laughter and whiskey, but overseen by a priest who spoke more about obedience than about love. By spring, Margaret was pregnant, and by summer she began to dream of rows of gravestones, each one bearing the name Murphy. She woke screaming so often that Seamus stopped sleeping altogether, keeping ledger books open by candlelight long past midnight, as though numbers might keep nightmares at bay. The firstborn Patrick Murphy entered the world healthy and loud, a boy with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's fierce eyes. Neighbors said the child had been born with strength in his cry, a good omen in a mining town where many babies did not survive infancy. But even from his earliest years, Patrick seemed to carry a gravity that weighed heavier than play or laughter. His teachers described him as serious, sometimes eerily so, a boy who lingered at the edges of playground games as though calculating unseen risks. Seamus doted on him with pride. Margaret, however, watched with unease. Each year that passed, she measured not just Patrick's growth but the shortening distance to the number that haunted her dreams. 21, the day of the explosion, March 15th, 1868. Patrick's 21st birthday. The morning was sharp and gray, frost lacing the windows of the Murphy cottage. Margaret cooked eggs and bread, though Patrick barely touched them. She touched his cheek and whispered that he should stay home, that a mother's instinct told her danger waited underground. But Patrick, stubborn as his father, insisted he had responsibilities. His crew descended into Shaft 7, 400 feet beneath the surface. The air grew heavy with methane, though company inspectors had declared it stable. Work began as usual, picks striking coal, lamps glowing faintly in the black. Then, at precisely 2:17 in the afternoon, a blast shook the earth. Windows rattled across town. Women rushed into the streets, clutching rosaries. When rescuers reached the tunnel, they found 11 miners unconscious but alive. Only Patrick was dead, his body lying at the exact center of the blast, untouched by fire or falling stone, as though he had simply lain down and let life slip away. Dr. Ezra Caldwell, Millfield's lone physician, examined the body. Later, in his private journal, he wrote, The boy's heart ceased in perfect synchrony with the blast, yet there is no mark of injury. As though some unseen hand plucked the thread of his life with surgical precision. The surviving miners told an even stranger story. Moments before the explosion, Patrick had checked his pocket watch, smiled, and said 2 words. "Time's up." In his coat pocket, they found a letter written in his hand 2 weeks earlier, with burial instructions and a chilling line at the bottom. "The first payment is made. The debt continues with my brothers." The Silence Keystone Coal declared the incident a tragic accident caused by negligence. They paid the Murphy family a small settlement and sealed the incident report. But in Millfield's taverns and church pews, whispers grew. Why had Patrick alone perished? Why had he seemed to know it was coming? Margaret's grief hardened into a conviction that the family was cursed, though she suspected curses did not come from heaven, but from men in dark. Offices with ledgers like her husband's. Seamus, meanwhile, drowned himself in numbers and whiskey. The once proud bookkeeper became brittle and short-tempered, snapping at his wife and children, refusing to speak of Patrick at all. But Thomas, the second son, could not let it rest. He began digging through old company records, whispering with miners who dared not speak aloud, chasing shadows that seemed to lead back not just to his brother's death, but to something far older, darker, and more deliberate. One fog-drenched morning in 1873, nearly 5 years after Patrick's death, Thomas Murphy climbed into the bell tower of St. Michael's Church, a rifle slung across his back. He told the priest below that assassins were coming for him, that his birthday had arrived, and with it the debt his brother had warned about. By noon, the bells began to toll, and with the 12th chime, Millfield would bear witness to a second, Murphy son's impossible, horrifying fate. The bell tower. The fog rolled into Millfield like a thief that March morning in 1873, swallowing the streets, muting every sound until even the church bells seemed to toll from nowhere. It was the kind of fog that made a town feel cut off from the world, or perhaps trapped in one of its own making. Inside St. Michael's Catholic Church, Father O'Malley shuffled down the narrow nave with his prayer book, the scent of old, incense still clinging to the wooden pews. He had come early for morning devotion. But when he entered the sanctuary, he saw something that made his old bones stiffen. The trapdoor to the bell tower was ajar, and wedged against it were the heavy benches normally lined up for parishioners. Someone had barricaded himself in. The priest climbed slowly, heart-pounding until he found Thomas Murphy crouched near the arched window, a rifle across his lap. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling, his hair wild from sleepless nights. He was barely 21, but already looked like a man who had seen a century of sorrow. "They're coming for me, Father," Thomas whispered, just like they came for Patrick. The descent into obsession Thomas had always been different from Patrick. Where his older brother bore responsibility like a second skin, Thomas bristled against authority. He argued with supervisors, defended fellow workers, and asked questions about things most men knew better than to question. After Patrick's death, his curiosity turned to obsession. He haunted the town's small library, rifling through mining reports. He tracked down the 11 men who had survived Shaft 7, pressing them for details they would rather forget. What he uncovered was damning. The tunnel had been flagged as unsafe in company records. Gas levels were dangerously high. Yet on Patrick's birthday, he was ordered underground for a special inspection. Thomas even found a letter, signed by Keystone's manager Josiah Bentley, instructing Patrick to work a double shift that day, against company policy. When Thomas confronted, his father, Seamus, snatched the letter from his hands and burned it in the fire. His voice, usually quiet and patient, rose to a harsh whisper. "Some secrets are better left buried, boy. Do you want to join your brother in the ground?" But Thomas couldn't stop. Each document he uncovered hinted at something larger, something older. Whispers of blood in the taverns, Thomas found ex-miners willing to talk after a few drinks. They spoke of blood contracts, whispered agreements that bound immigrant families to Keystone's fortunes. The story was always the same. In exchange for employment and protection, each family owed a tithe, a life, paid in blood, usually the firstborn son at 21. Most men laughed nervously after telling it, insisting it was just a superstition, an old tale used to keep workers obedient. But the look in their eyes betrayed belief, and Thomas, turning 21 himself, began to believe it too. He started carrying his father's old hunting rifle. He avoided walking alone. He wrote frantic notes in a journal filled with warnings. "They will not catch me unaware. If I must die, I will die with my eyes open." By the week of his birthday, he barely ate or slept. His mother found him one morning staring out his window, muttering about figures in the fog. "They watch me," he told her. "Every corner, every shadow. If I live past tomorrow, it will be because I struck first." The Bell Tower Vigil. The morning of March 22, 1873, Thomas climbed into St. Michael's Bell Tower before dawn. He dragged benches up the narrow stairwell, wedging them into place to block anyone from reaching him. From this height, he told himself, he could see the entire town, see them coming before they could strike. Father O'Malley found him there, hours later, haggard and trembling. "Thomas, my son," the priest said gently, lifting his hands in a placating gesture. "This is God's house. Lay down the gun and tell me what burdens you." "They'll be here at noon," Thomas said. "Just as they came for Patrick at 2:17. They don't make mistakes. They come when the clock strikes." The priest listened as Thomas spilled a torrent of accusations. He spoke of contracts signed decades earlier, of blood debts owed by families, of deaths disguised as accidents. O'Malley wanted to dismiss it as grief-fueled madness. But the specificity of Thomas's words, the names, the dates, the patterns, sent a chill through him. Thomas pointed through the fog. "There, 3 men in dark coats. Not from Millfield. Don't you see them?" O'Malley squinted but saw nothing unusual. Yet Thomas raised the rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. Noon, at exactly noon, the bells began to toll. The moment Thomas fired, the rifle exploded. The blast shattered the window, blew smoke into the tower, and flung Thomas backwards against the stone wall. Father O'Malley fainted. When he awoke minutes later, the scene chilled him more than the explosion itself. Thomas was kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, his face serene, unmarked by injury, as though death had sculpted him into a grotesque icon of devotion. Even stranger, every clock in Millfield had stopped at the exact moment of his death. For 21 seconds, the town was frozen in silence before time resumed. The cover-up Keystone Coal ruled Thomas's death an accident, blaming defective ammunition. The rifle's manufacturer in Philadelphia denied responsibility but could prove nothing. The matter was quickly closed, but whispers again spread through Millfield. 2 Murphy sons, dead on their 21st birthdays. Margaret began haunting the cemetery each night, cataloging the graves of other young men who had died at the same age, German, Italian, Irish sons whose families had quietly accepted company, compensation, and remained silent. Her suspicion hardened into certainty. This was no curse. It was payment. The leather satchel in. The days after Thomas's funeral, Seamus changed. He stormed into Josiah Bentley's office one morning carrying a leather satchel. Witnesses heard shouting through the heavy oak door. Objects thrown. Furniture overturned. When Seamus emerged 2 hours later, his face was pale, the satchel gone. Bentley canceled his appointments for the week. Something had passed between them, something terrible enough to shake them both. That night, Seamus sat at the kitchen table staring into a glass of whiskey. "There's a price to prosperity," he muttered, "and we've already paid too much." Margaret pressed him, but he would say no more. By then, Michael Murphy, the 3rd son, had begun his own search. At 19, he was clever, restless, and unwilling to wait for fate to come for him. One December night, he stumbled upon a hidden cache in the church basement, a bundle of contracts scrawled in Latin and English, bearing names of Millfield's families. And at the bottom of one contract, written in Seamus Murphy's father's hand, was a chilling line: 7 sons, in exchange for passage and prosperity. Michael's 21st birthday was less than 2 years away. The contracts, the winter of 1873, pressed Millfield beneath a blanket of snow so heavy it seemed the town might vanish beneath it. Smoke from the coal furnaces hung low over the rooftops, trapped by the gray sky, turning the air into something thick enough to taste. In the Murphy cottage, the silence between husband and wife had grown suffocating. Seamus drank and muttered of debts no ledger could balance. Margaret lingered at the cemetery until her skirts were stiff with frost, whispering prayers over the graves of her first two sons. But it was Michael, 19 years old, who refused to let silence dictate his future. Where Patrick had been dutiful and Thomas defiant, Michael was sharp-eyed and calculating, a young man who wanted to know why. And one December evening, while exploring the church basement, he found the answer, or at least a fragment of it. There is a hidden ledger. The church was empty when Michael slipped inside. Snow pressed against the stained glass windows, muting the colored light. He carried only a lantern, its weak glow throwing shadows against the stone walls. In the basement, behind, a stack of hymnals long forgotten, he found a false panel. Inside, wrapped in cloth that smelled of mildew, was a collection of documents. Contracts written in a blend of English and Latin legalese, their ink faded, but their words sharp enough to cut through time. Each contract bore a family name familiar to Millfield, Flanagan, Steiner, Rossini. And there, in the center of the stack, Murphy. Michael's hands trembled as he read. For passage and prosperity, for housing and protection, the undersigned agrees to provide tithe of blood. The eldest son of each generation shall be offered upon his 21st year, that the prosperity of Keystone and Millfield be assured. At the bottom, the signature of Seamus's father, a man Michael had never met. And below that, written in an unfamiliar hand, 7 sons. The kitchen table. That night, Michael spread the papers across the kitchen table, lantern light dancing over the ink. Margaret's storm-gray eyes widened as she read, her breath quickening. It's true, she whispered. All those graves. Not accidents, not curses, payments. Seamus burst into the room red-faced from whiskey and swept the contracts to the floor. His hands shook as he tore them to shreds, the veins in his neck bulging. Burn them, he shouted. Never speak of this again. Do you want to invite their eyes upon us? Margaret clutched Michael's arm, pulling him back as her husband's fury boiled over. Seamus was a man undone, his honesty shattered, his guilt laid bare. When the last scraps of paper were tossed into the fire, Seamus slumped into a chair, his face gray and hollow. You think you found something new? He muttered, staring into the flames. But this debt was written before you were born, before I was born. It cannot be undone. Margaret's eyes blazed. If it cannot be undone, then it must be fought. The shrine from that night forward. Margaret changed. She built a small shrine in her bedroom, candles flickering around a crucifix blackened with soot. She whispered prayers not of peace, but of defiance. She studied the other graves in Millfield, mapping the pattern of deaths. And she began making secret copies of any document she could find, scraps of evidence to one day confront the company. Her neighbors whispered that grief had broken her. But Michael saw something else, a fire that had been lit, a mother determined. To wage war against an enemy most people were too afraid to name. The priest's confession Margaret brought the copies to Father O'Malley. At first the priest resisted, trembling at the thought of crossing Keystone. But when Margaret produced one contract with his own predecessor's signature as witness, his face went pale. He led her to the sacristy, where behind a false wall, he revealed an old ledger, not prayer records but spiritual transactions, names, dates, offerings. There it was in Seamus's father's hand. Murphy, 7 sons, tithe of blood. The priest's hand shook as he closed the book. I baptized these children, he whispered, all the while knowing the font was poisoned. The bargain word reached Michael that Josiah Bentley himself had learned of his inquiries. Bentley was no longer just a manager, but a presence in Millfield. his name spoken with the same caution as a curse. One bitter March morning, Michael stormed into Keystone's office carrying a copy of his grandfather's contract. He demanded to see Bentley and the board. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal. Bentley, usually composed, grew frantic at the sight of the document. His voice slipped into a language no one recognized. The other officials huddled, then offered Michael a bargain silence. In exchange, the Murphy family would be released from obligations and given enough money to vanish. Michael spat on the floor. Some debts are not mine to honor. He turned and walked out. As he did, Ezra Caldwell, Bentley's cousin, and Keystone's legal counsel called after him. Some contracts cannot be broken, boy. Your brothers learned that. And so will you. The shadow of strangers. From that day, Michael was watched. Men in dark coats loitered near the tavern, appeared at the edges of crowds, vanished when approached. But Margaret, hardened by grief, rallied, allies. She whispered to other families, showing them the evidence she'd gathered. She begged Father O'Malley for sanctuary, and she made plans, desperate, dangerous plans, to confront the system that had taken her sons. Michael, however, refused to hide. If they want me, he said, let them try in the open. I'll not die in the dark like Patrick, nor by trickery like Thomas. Then came the news that shattered the fragile balance. Josiah Bentley was found slumped over his desk, dead of an apparent heart attack. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. In his hand, a half-written letter. The contracts must end. The rest trailed off in illegible scrawl. With Bentley's death, the web of secrecy began to fray. Confessions leaked, alliances crumbled, and the Murphys' enemies grew desperate. And as Michael's 21st birthday approached, Millfield braced itself for another reckoning, one that would not unfold in silence but in fire. Fire in the veins. The morning after Josiah Bentley's sudden death, Millfield woke to the sound of whispers rather than coal carts. Doors cracked open just wide enough for neighbors to trade fearful glances. A man as powerful as Bentley was not supposed to die without explanation. Yet there he was, slumped at his desk, eyes wide, hand clutching a half-written confession that trailed off into frantic scratches. Some swore his face had been frozen in terror. Others claimed the corpse was still warm when found, though no one had entered or left his locked office for hours. Whatever the truth, one fact spread faster than any rumor. Bentley had written the words, "The contracts must end." And for Keystone Coal, those words were not just treason. They were contagion. The town turns at first. The Murphys thought Bentley's death might free them. But instead, the walls closed tighter. Seamus was fired from his accounting post within days. No explanation, no severance, just a thin slip of paper and an unspoken warning. The family's credit at the company store was cut. Neighbors who once nodded politely now turned away. One by one, shopkeepers refused to sell to them. Margaret came home empty-handed, the children staring at her hollow-eyed. Even Brendan, still a boy of 14, was jeered and shoved at school, the other children chanting, "Cursed, cursed." Millfield itself seemed to reject them. The fire at St. Michael's, Father O'Malley tried to shield them. He kept Michael close, offering him work around the church, but it was not enough. On a cold April night, St. Michael's went up in flames. The priest barely escaped, his cassock blackened, coughing smoke. The official cause was declared a faulty stove. But everyone in Millfield knew better. The fire was punishment, a warning to anyone who might think of siding with the Murphys. When O'Malley showed Margaret the charred remains of the hidden ledger he had risked his life to save, her eyes gleamed with a dangerous clarity. "They burn the church," she said, voice low. "They burn their own sanctuaries to keep their secret safe. That is the measure of the men we face." Dr. Caldwell's last entry. The physician, Ezra Caldwell, was next. For years he had played reluctant accomplice, signing falsified reports under Keystone's orders, even as he documented the truth in private. When a state commission summoned him to testify about labor practices in Pennsylvania's mining towns, hope flickered. Perhaps at last the conspiracy would be dragged into the light. But days before his journey, Caldwell was found slumped over his desk, a vial of laudanum overturned beside him. His suicide note read, "I can no longer carry this guilt." Margaret did not believe it. She touched the note with gloved hands and whispered, "They silenced him, just as they silenced my sons." That night she lit candles at her shrine and vowed that Michael would not be next. Michael, however, had no intention of hiding. He spoke openly in taverns, daring the company to come for him. Patrick died in silence. Thomas died in secrecy. If I must die, it will be in the open, with every man and woman watching. Some admired his defiance. Others begged him to stop before he doomed them all. But Michael carried himself like a man already condemned, and that kind of courage, or madness, is infectious. Soon whispers of rebellion stirred in Millfield. Families who had lost sons at 21 remembered accidents that had never felt like accidents. The Murphys' defiance gave their grief new shape, not curse, but conspiracy, and Keystone could not allow that fire to spread. Retaliation. In May of 1874, Seamus was found on the road outside town, beaten near to death. He never saw the faces of his attackers. Margaret fell ill soon after, her strength drained by fevers that no doctor could explain. Some neighbors muttered about Miner's sickness, but others whispered darker things, poisons that leave no trace. The Murphys' cottage was vandalized, rocks through windows, dead animals left on the doorstep. Every act a reminder, you are marked. The gathering, but Margaret refused to yield. With Father O'Malley now in hiding, she gathered other mothers in secret, women who had buried sons at 21. They met by lantern light in kitchens, barns, even graveyards, whispering their truths. Each had the same story. Sons offered advancement shortly before their deaths, families compensated with unusual generosity, and, most chilling of all, letters left behind by the young men speaking of debts, of fate, of knowing their time had come. It was too consistent to be coincidence. Together, they vowed to break the silence. The approach of the birthday Michael's 21st birthday loomed. With each passing day, the town seemed to grow more tense, as though everyone waited for a thunderclap that had been foretold. Strangers appeared again, men in dark coats, their faces pale, their eyes flat as stones. They asked questions in the taverns, loitered near the Murphy cottage, vanished when confronted. Margaret barely slept. She nailed rosaries to the walls, burned candles until the house smelled of wax and smoke, whispered prayers that sounded more like bargains. Seamus, meanwhile, sat in silence most nights, staring at nothing, his hands shaking. Whatever he had, carried in that leather satchel to Bentley's office, it had broken something in him beyond repair. Michael watched them both and made his own decision. He would not run. He would not hide in basements or churches. On his 21st birthday, he would face them, whoever they were, in the open. The morning of March 15, 1875, dawned bitter cold. Snow laced the ground, but the air buzzed with tension. In the town square, Michael stood with his family beside him. Around them gathered dozens of allies, miners, widows, even strangers from nearby towns who had heard whispers of Millfield's curse. And at the edge of the crowd, 3 men in dark coats appeared, their faces unreadable, moving forward as though they had been expected. The bells began to toll, and the town of Millfield braced itself to witness whether the Murphy curse would claim its 3rd son, or whether Michael would shatter it in blood and fire. The debt collectors, the square of Millfield, had never been so crowded. On most mornings it was just miners passing to the lamp house, women bargaining at the company store, children darting underfoot. But on March 15, 1875, the square became something else: a tribunal, an execution ground, a theater. Michael Murphy stood at its center, shoulders squared, breath fogging in the frigid air. He wore no uniform of labor or church, only his father's wool coat, patched at the elbows. and boots scarred by years of mine dust. To the watching crowd, he looked less like a victim than a challenger. Behind him stood Margaret, pale but resolute, her rosaries wrapped around her wrists like chains. Beside her, Seamus hunched in silence, the years of whiskey etched into his trembling hands. Brendan, still too young to understand the full horror, clutched his mother's skirt. The bells of St. Michael's tolled noon, and that was when the strangers arrived. The men in coats, 3 of them. Always 3. Their coats were the color of coal, their hats pulled low, their faces gaunt. They moved with the precision of men who had done this before, countless times, in countless towns. No one knew their names. Some said they were company enforcers. Others whispered they were priests of a darker church bound to the contracts. They stepped into the square without hesitation, and though they said nothing, the crowd parted as if compelled by unseen hands. One of them carried a leather folio, thick with documents. Another wore gloves stained with something that might have been ink or blood. The third carried nothing at all, but his eyes, cold, gray, unblinking, seemed to weigh Michael like a butcher measures a carcass. The confrontation, Michael's voice rang out, steady though his chest hammered. You took my brothers. You took Patrick in the mines, Thomas in the tower. You think you'll take me the same way. But today I stand in the open and the whole town will see you for what you are. The men did not answer. The one with the folio opened it, flipped pages, and read in a voice that carried unnaturally across the crowd. Murphy, line of Seamus, son number 3, payment due. Contract dated 1821, witnessed and sealed. Terms: tithe of blood. Eldest, son upon the 120th year. Failure to comply, forfeit security of family and prosperity of community. He closed the folio with a snap. The debt must be honored. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Faces turned pale. Here it was, spoken aloud, no longer whispered. Margaret stepped forward, voice shaking with fury. What god do you serve, demanding children as coin? The man with gray eyes tilted his head. Not God. Contract. The clock stops. As the confrontation thickened, the bells of St. Michael's froze mid-strike. Every clock in Millfield stopped. At the same moment, hands fixed on 12, pendulums halted in mid-swing. A silence fell that was heavier than snow, heavier than grief. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that time itself had been bound by the same bargain that bound their sons. Michael felt it too. He raised his chin, refusing to let the weight crush him. If I must pay, he said, then I will pay on my own terms. But you will not silence me. The attempted execution. The man with the gloves reached into his coat and drew something small, a device no larger than a matchbox, covered in wires. To the miners watching, it looked like the detonators used in blasting tunnels. Gasps rose. If triggered, it would mean another explosion, another accident. But before he could press it, Michael lunged. Years of labor had hardened him. He slammed into the man, knocking the device to the cobblestones. It skittered away, landing near the boots of a miner who quickly kicked it into the snow. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men surged forward. The 3 strangers drew pistols, but were swallowed by the crowd. Fists flew. The square became a frenzy of rage long held back, finally unleashed. The folio falls in the melee. The leather folio was torn from the stranger's hands. Its pages scattered, caught in the cold wind, fluttering through the square like blackened snow. Children grabbed them. Miners stuffed them into pockets. Mothers wept as they read family names scrawled in ink: Flanagan, Rossini, Steiner, Murphy, each followed by clauses, payments, signatures. It was no longer rumor, no longer curse. It was law, and now it was in everyone's hands. The blood price, but victory was not yet won. In the confusion, the man with gray eyes fired a single shot. The sound cracked through the square, silencing the chaos. Michael staggered, clutching his side, red blooming through his coat. Margaret screamed. Seamus lunged forward, catching his son before he fell. For a moment it seemed the prophecy had held. The 3rd Murphy son struck down on his 21st birthday. But Michael, teeth gritted, forced himself upright. Blood ran down his hand, but his voice rose strong. "They cannot kill me in silence. You all see it now. You all know." The crowd roared, a wave of defiance that surged against the three strangers. Overwhelmed, the men were seized, their weapons torn away. The interrogation dragged to the steps of the burned-out church. The strangers were beaten, bound, and forced to speak. Under blows and threats, they revealed themselves not as supernatural agents but hired men, assassins sent from town to town, trained to stage accidents, to carry out payments so that families would never resist. But when pressed for who gave the orders, they said only one name: Keystone. And when asked why the deaths always came at 21, the man with gray eyes smiled through bloodied teeth. Because 21 is the age of inheritance, the age when sons become men. Better to cut the line clean before rebellion takes root. That night, as Michael lay pale and fevered in his mother's bed, the stolen contract spread like wildfire through Pennsylvania. Newspapers whispered, investigators stirred. Families realized their tragedies were not curses but calculated murders. But Keystone did not die easily. And as Margaret listened to her son's ragged breathing, she felt it, the shadow still pressing in, larger now, enraged by exposure. Michael had survived his 21st birthday, but the debt, she knew, was not yet paid. The last debt for 3 days after the square erupted in violence, Millfield, was a town suspended between triumph and terror. On one hand, the contracts were no longer rumor. Their pages blew through the streets, nailed to tavern doors, read aloud in kitchens. Mothers clutched them with trembling hands, finally understanding the accidents that had stolen their sons. Fathers cursed their own complicity, realizing wages and housing had been bought with their children's blood. But on the other hand, Keystone's shadow grew longer. The company had ruled for decades, its reach stretching from Harrisburg to Philadelphia. A mob in one mining town could not topple an empire, and everyone knew. Retaliation was coming. The retaliation, it began. With silence, coal shipments were halted. Stores closed. Wages went unpaid. A famine of money and food swept Millfield, deliberate and crushing. Then came the threats. Anonymous notes slipped under doors. Withdraw your claims. The company provides. The company protects. Then, violence. Houses burned in the night. Men vanished. A boy of 17 was found drowned in the creek. His family had spoken too loudly of the contracts. The Murphys bore the brunt. Their windows shattered nightly. Crosses were slashed into their door. Margaret's shrine was desecrated, her candles crushed into the floor. And through it all, Michael lingered on the edge of death, his wound festering, fever burning. He was alive. The first Murphy son to survive his 21st birthday. But survival had made him a target even sharper than death. Seamus's collapse. Seamus, once the family's anchor, now unraveled completely. Each night he muttered into his whiskey about the satchel he had carried into Bentley's office. Sometimes he swore it contained proof of the contracts. Other times he claimed it held his own signature, a renewal of the bargain. Margaret pressed him, begged him for truth, but he only wept. One dawn, Brendan found him slumped by the creek, water lapping at his boots, lips whispering, "The debt cannot be escaped." From that day, Seamus spoke little. He drifted like a ghost through the cottage, a man who had surrendered to an enemy he could not name. Margaret's decision, however, hardened. Grief had stripped her down to bone and steel. When Michael recovered enough to sit up, she told him plainly, "We cannot stay. Millfield is ash and chains. If we stay, they will finish what they began. We must go west, beyond their reach." Michael argued. He wanted to fight to expose Keystone fully, but Margaret knew the cost. Every witness who had tried to testify was silenced. Every priest or doctor who spoke out was ruined. Better to live in exile, she said, than to die in righteousness. And so, one summer night in 1874, the Murphys left Millfield. They carried little, 2 bags, a handful of coins, a stack of smuggled contracts Margaret had hidden in her skirts. They did not say goodbye. By dawn, they were gone. Cedar Falls. Murphys reappeared months later in Cedar Falls, Oregon, a logging town carved into the Cascade Mountains. Here, no one had heard of Keystone. No one whispered of contracts. The work was brutal but honest. Men cut timber instead of coal. Families built houses instead of shacks. Michael found work as a timber cruiser, measuring forests for the mills. He married a local woman, Sarah Donnelly, and started a family. Brendan grew into a schoolteacher, respected and free of whispers. For the first time in decades, the Murphy name carried no curse. And when Brendan turned 21 in 1880, the family held their breath. But the day passed, without incident. The curse, it seemed, had been broken, the return of the past, but curses do not die so easily. In 1885, Michael's firstborn son, Patrick, named after his dead uncle, turned 16, and with his adolescence came strange dreams. He dreamed of tunnels collapsing, of bells frozen mid-toll, of headstones stretching endlessly across a gray field. He woke in the night muttering Latin phrases no one had taught him. Most disturbing of all, he became obsessed with family history. He pressed Michael for details, demanded to know why they had left Pennsylvania, begged to see the hidden papers Margaret kept locked in a trunk. Michael refused, but the boy found them anyway, and once he read the contracts, his fate was sealed. The gathering storm by 1887, whispers of labor conspiracies had reached even Oregon. Journalists from the East carried stories of families bound to companies by blood oaths, of young men dying at 21. Patrick Jr. began corresponding with activists, sending them copies of the contracts. He traveled to Portland to speak at meetings, his voice clear and fiery. Michael begged him to stop. "You don't understand what follows when you speak too loud," he said. "You don't know the reach of the men you provoke." But Patrick only smiled with the reckless courage of youth. "Then let them come, I will not die in silence." The celebration on March 15, 1888, exactly 20 years after Patrick Murphy Sr. had died in Shaft 7, his nephew celebrated his 21st birthday. But this time he was not alone. More than 50 men and women gathered in Cedar Falls Square, armed with rifles and axes. Journalists stood ready with notebooks. The labor movement had sent representatives from across the region. If the debt collectors came, they would be met not with silence, but with fire and witness. And come they did. 3. Men in dark coats, their faces different, but they're bearing the same. They moved through the crowd with the same precision, the same inevitability. But when they reached Patrick, they found not one vulnerable heir, but an army of allies. The crowd seized them, disarmed them, and forced them to speak. The revelation under interrogation, the truth spilled out. The contracts were never supernatural. They were tools of control, designed by industrialists to keep immigrant families compliant. The deaths were staged accidents, triggered explosions, sabotaged rifles, drowned boys held under water by unseen hands, always disguised, always explained. Away. And Keystone was not alone. Similar systems stretched across a dozen states, hidden in plain sight beneath the machinery of progress. The testimony of the captured assassins, published by newspapers across the country, ignited outrage. Lawsuits followed. Labor reform spread. The web began to unravel. The fall of Keystone by 1889. Keystone Coal and Iron declared bankruptcy. Its leaders fled or faced prosecution. Other companies quietly dissolved their contracts, fearing exposure. The Murphy family, once cursed, became a symbol of resistance. Their suffering had forced the nation to confront horrors it had long ignored. Michael lived to see his children grow. Brendan became a respected educator. Patrick Jr. grew into a leader of the labor movement, his name spoken not with dread but with pride. The graves in Pennsylvania remained, 7 headstones in a forgotten cemetery, but their silence no longer held power. The twist, and yet, legends cling harder than facts. Even after the trials ended, even after the contracts were burned, Stories persisted of clocks freezing in certain towns, of bells tolling without hands to strike them, of young men whispering, "Time's up," as if echoing the first Patrick's final words. Some swore the death stopped because the debt had been paid in full. Others insisted the blood tithe had simply shifted, carried into new industries, new bargains, new contracts inked in boardrooms instead of coal dust. And in Oregon, when Michael Murphy died an old man, his grandchildren swore that on his last night, every clock in Cedar Falls stopped for exactly 21 seconds. The story of the Murphy family is written not just in ledgers and headstones, but in the uneasy truth that sometimes horror wears the mask of progress. The sons who died at 21 were not victims of superstition or ghosts, but of men who saw human lives as currency. And though the contracts were destroyed, the lesson remains. The most terrifying curses are not the ones whispered in graveyards, but the ones signed in ink and enforced in silence. The Murphy name survived. The system that killed them did not. But the graves still stand in Pennsylvania, weeds growing tall, the stones weathered but legible. And if you stand there on a cold March morning, some claim you can still hear it. The faint toll of a bell, frozen mid-strike,